Thanks. Thank you, Monique, for that wonderful introduction. It's a bit overstated, but it's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, now it's my opportunity to give my opinion on how I think things should work. And so, friends of mine who might have different opinions, please suspend your judgment at this stage, and then we can pick up our friendship afterwards. Hopefully, I wouldn't have offended too many of you. Okay, so we've heard about the policing, we've heard about harm reduction, but where does this lead? And how often have I heard that addicts need treatment, not prison? Okay? Addicts need treatment, not prison. Shame, these poor people. They need treatment, not prison. Really? Who's an addict? And even if you meet the criteria for substance use disorder, how many people actually need treatment? We don't know in South Africa specifically, because we don't have population-sized studies. But if we look at very robust studies from the United States using huge samples, we find that the probability of remission, and this is a study by William White. I like this one because it's all the studies done since 1896, I think, right up to 2011. Every single scientific study that mentioned remission. It says basically that almost everybody will remit. Okay? Some people might die along the way, and we acknowledge that. And the smaller marks that you will see up there, the little graph, the sort of light bluey color, that's how many will remit in the first year after meeting the criteria. The orange is in the first decade, and the yellow is in a lifetime. All right? Now that's quite encouraging, but it's not what we hear. We hear once an addict, always an addict. And what is the most effective treatment there is? 73% of people recover or resolve, I prefer the word resolve, their substance use issues or problematic drug use using this particular treatment. And this fantastic treatment is absolutely nothing. They don't go into treatment, but they resolve their problems. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking that's simply not true. Well, go and look at the data, go and check the data. That is what the data says, whether we like it or not. That is what the data says. So as Mike Ashton says, recovery is not an aberration achieved by a small, morally enlightened minority of addicted people. If there were a natural developmental momentum within the course of these problems, it is towards remission and recovery. The central problem is not the difficulty of making recovery possible. That potential clearly exists. It is instead the long time between the problem onset and successful recovery stabilization and the significant harm to individuals, families, and communities in the interim. So we've got to look at where that harm lies, and as I think we're beginning to clearly see, one of the big contributors to that is our public policy. But why do we get this thing so wrong then? Why is the popular narrative so different? And the reason is of a thing called Bergson's bias or clinician's bias. Because if you looked at every single person, let's say you worked in a pneumonia ward, and everybody that came into that ward was dying of pneumonia, but they all started with flu. You would think that flu was or a common cold was a deadly disease if they started with flu. You'd think it was deadly. You'd think that the first symptom, you need to put them in there. And what happens when you put them into the hospital is there are other pathogens they get exposed to. They feel sicker because you're telling them they're sick. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The problem is that in the fields of drugs, we only see the worst people because nobody who uses drugs without problems, almost nobody, is prepared to admit it. Why not? Because of the stigma attached to it. Okay? So here's a friend of mine, one of these friends who's going to probably not speak to me for about a week after this. Ashley, are you there? Hi. Okay, apparently Ashley's got a drug problem, just like our mayor. My name's Patricia DeLille, and I have a drug problem. She claims not to use them, but I'm sorry, we all use drugs in one form or another. Okay? The illicit part is something made up. It is something that we've decided as a society. It doesn't make it invalid totally, because perception is everything, but it is made up. Now here's a young man from Durban who was interviewed in a great article. He doesn't have a drug problem, he's got a drug solution. Drugs solve a lot of the issues that he faces every day. They take away the hunger, they take away the boredom, they increase motivation, they provide structure, meaning, and they provide vocation. So, basically, the drugs are his solution. They make life tolerable forever, every day. Now, I'm not saying everybody's like this. We know there is a small subset of people with comorbidities that perhaps do need some treatment, but is that for the comorbidity? Is that for the drug? And here's Omar. Some of you might remember Omar from some of the adverts. And Omar has a drug policy problem, because Omar is likely to have started off as an adolescent, maybe with a cannabis charge, or in an environment where gangsterism is rife. And it's the same environment that leads to increased salience for drugs as it does for the attraction of gangsterism. And poor Omar probably started off like a lot of other people, some of whom are in this room, but he was criminalized and possibly pathologized in today's world, but back then, definitely not. He was just criminalized. And so William Miller, the father of motivational interviewing, he says, to what extent is your program making people's lives better rather than simply suppressing alcohol and drug use? Structured assessment using appropriate brief well-being measures could facilitate discussions about broader life needs to be addressed. Further insights from the literature on subjective well-being may inform services and interventions to help people establish happier, more meaningful lives within which addiction holds less attraction. In other words, we want to make the drugs less important for people. I personally don't believe that it's our duty to get people to stop using drugs, because for some people, like medication, dependent use is not a problem. It is a benefit. Who am I to say yes or no? So we always go on about these things. I mean, amphetamine. We've got legal amphetamine. Ritalin. Methylphenidate. It's there. Adderall, which is pretty close to methamphetamine. Modafinil, which we're not quite sure how that works, but it's a stimulant. We've got these drugs. So are we improving the quality of life of people? And often we're not when we're trying to clamp down on them. We're certainly not through police action. We know that. Unless the police action is part of an enabling environment and it's actually a harm reduction reaction, we're not. And often this thing called treatment is not making their life any better either. The majority of people who use drugs do not need treatment. What do they need though? They need the things that help them find less importance or less salience in the drugs that they're using, so that they don't become habitual and without thought. If people use drugs, I've always said at the program I used to run, I said, I don't care whether you use drugs or not. I just want you the majority of times to make a conscious decision, because nobody makes a conscious decision about stuff every single time they do it. I just want you to do that the majority of times. So, Gabor Martis says that, and I like the statement. I think he's got some things wrong, but basically what he's saying is be present with people. Now, all of these models on the individual should be translated to the to the wider scope. So for example, when we've learned that in 40 years, that confrontational approaches do not work with individuals. They cause things to go worse most of the time. Okay? Why are we using it on a macro level? It doesn't make any sense. So what should the response be? It should be relevant. It should be welcoming. It should be low threshold. We don't want to see people when they've got a big problem. We want to see them before they've got a problem. It should be available immediately. Now, can you imagine a guy smoked a couple of joints and you bring him in and you say, hey, you can never use another drug again in your life. You can't drink alcohol, ever. You've got a disease. What is the guy going to think? Is he going to come back to you? I doubt it. All right? I remember sitting at a lung institute, at the Lung Institute, where they were doing a study, and they were talking about people living in an impoverished community, and before they left the TB hospital, they were saying to them, you must stop using drugs, and just drumming it into them. You can't take your TB meds with drugs, and that on and on and on. And one of the anthropologists stood up and said, how cruel and unkind is this? You are taking away the one thing that they've got to cope in their community. Have you been there? Have you sat amongst them? I bet you haven't. And she was dead right. It should be accessible. It can be brief and in a non-specific setting. Somebody goes to a doctor. That can be a brief intervention. We know that these things work. It needs to be individualized. For one person, cannabis can be a huge problem. For some person, it can be a harm reduction method from heroin. For another person, it might just do better on heroin. It should allow for the resolution of past issues. It should look beyond the drugs and drug use, and it should be collaborative. People who use drugs are the experts in their own lives. My whole approach with people in a one-on-one basis has been, I don't know, you do though. And what you do is you create a creative space for that person, a comfortable space where people can do that. Now, I know I'm running short on time, but I want to touch on something here. How do you do this? How do you put it together? That's the question. And I think the city of Tshwane are getting it right. They're the closest thing I've seen to this. And this does not happen anywhere else in the world. This is a first. And this is really exciting for me. So very briefly, and I'm going to go 1 minute over, I'm pretty sure. Do I have your permission? Okay. All right. In our communities, we know that they're drugs. We have no clues what is being used, or who is using them, or how often they are using, who is experiencing problems, what is the risk profile, what correlations are there. We have no idea. So when I read that South Africa is the #1 country in the world for drug abuse, it's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. In fact, Africa as a whole has less problems, although they are increasing. But we don't know. That's the truth. All right? We also don't know what families should do, what services are available, what medications are needed, what is working, and how do we monitor success. Well, actually, we know quite a lot of that, but we think we don't know because nobody's talking about it. And so what we've got is we've got this binary approach to dealing with substance use. These are our current responses. What happens is we take everybody along a whole spectrum, and this is a spectrum that I've got up at the top there. It says from maternal use, so the red line is a person's developmental process. As they get born, the mom might be using, their family might be using, they might get interested as they enter early adolescence, they might start experimenting, there's recreational use, or I don't like the term recreational use, I learned this the other day, a much better term for it, adult use. I think that's a great term. Neil and Raquel were teaching me about that. I used to just use the term use. There's mild so-called SUD or substance use disorder, moderate and severe. I don't really buy into those terms, but I use them because that's what's in the DSM at this stage. And what do? We just tell people, we search our schools. How does that affect the dynamic with police, Greg? I mean, can you imagine as a kid, you've been terrorized by police in your own school and it doesn't stop drug use? It's pointless, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, and it is damaging people, right? Don't do drugs, don't do drugs, don't do drugs. They're going to kill you, they're going to kill you, they're going to kill you. And you smoke pot and it does nothing. It does. Negative. for the majority of people, but for some people it does. But let's face it, you shouldn't be smoking pot at 15 years old. Okay? It's not the best time to do it when your endogenous cannabinoid system is busy developing. Okay? But we're not stopping it by having these punitive measures. We've just got stigma and exclusion and these short-term, intensive, abstinence-focused treatment programs that do not work, ladies and gentlemen. There's not one study anywhere in the world, not one. I know I'm done, but I'm not. Not one study anywhere in the world that tells us that 28-day Minnesota model treatment does any better than spontaneous remission, and there are a number that say it actually does worse. Fact. But what we've got in Tshwane is this community-oriented primary care system, where you've got community health workers. I'm not going to go into this. Prof. Hugo is an expert on it. But they're in the community. These people are in the community. They're establishing relationships already. They've got a high-care, high-touch, high-tech system. So community health workers go into households, and they're able to screen people. They're able to do individual assessments. It all goes up onto a cloud. There's a process called the LISA process. I always get the acronym wrong, but basically what you do is you map the area, you make sure what resources you've got. And we don't only look for drug treatment resources, they look for dancing, they look for football clubs, churches, art classes, all of these kind of things that make life interesting. And you put it together because you're going to every single household in the community, not just cherry picking them, every single household. And suddenly what we get, and we got some preliminary data, but it's not for sharing at this stage, there's some issues. But the point is, you've now got data on prevalence, types of drugs, the method of use, the resources available, and the community support. What level of community support is there? And we start getting to understand the extent of the problem, the services needed, the services available. How can we design an intervention when we don't even know this? Okay, I'm going to skip a couple of these quickly. But you put this all together, and you've got an enabling environment. You're delivering brief interventions at the home level. Don't kick your kid out of home just because he smoked cannabis once. When the school wants to suspend you for 2 weeks because you tested positive for cannabis, what they're doing testing for drugs in schools, I do not know. It is criminal. Okay? It's pathologizing, it's othering, it's dangerous. But when you put it together in an enabling environment where people can get support, we start getting something that looks like this. And it's a continuum of care that is non-pathologizing, but based in public health. We've got multiple interactions and points of contact with the person. Because you've got a community health worker going to the house in the first 1,000 days. We know the Western Cape's got that kind of program. We know that it improves outcomes. We've got people dealing with the family. Moms are not pathologized and kicked out of antenatal care simply because they're using a drug. Rather, the harms are mitigated. We keep them in care. We know that drawing people closer is better than pushing them away. This is logic. We have harm reduction. And the only people who end up being pathologized and going into institutions are the ones right at the end of that spectrum, who've usually got a comorbidity. Because if we look at what it is that stops people from getting better, there are only a couple of reasons. One is stigma, othering, undue pathologization, criminalization, or comorbidities and other complex issues that make them particularly vulnerable. And of course, one of the big drivers is poverty. If we could take, like Olga's suggesting, 10, 20% of our policing funds and put it into communities, we would solve the majority of the problematic drug use in our country. We won't stop people using drugs. We'll never do that. But it won't become as problematic. It'll be more conscious, it will be more utilitarian, and it very seldom becomes a problem in those environments. Read the data, and even if you don't like it, read some more until you have to accept it. Because we've got a choice. Do we follow in the steps of Western countries who've overly pathologized, who've overly criminalized, and ended up with a bigger problem than they started off with? Or do we find our own solution based on community? Why do you think Africa hasn't got as big a problem as the rest of the world, or didn't have it? It's because of our sense of community, because we look after each other, we raise each other's children, and we keep a lookout for each other. And if we stop doing that, we are going to die from the drugs that are coming into our countries rather than benefit from them. That's all I've got to say today. Thank you very much.